So, where are women under attack?
Yeah,
Please explain.
You're the voice for men, eh?
That's right.
The one who posts all those...
Oh, those criminals? Those criminals' identities? Yes, we did.
It's not your decision to decide who's criminals and who's
I don't know, the videos kind of made it pretty clear. Very good, you can yell. How about we talk rationally? Why do we have to get off your campus? What are you so afraid of? Why, what are you so afraid of in the discourse?
Here, I belong. You're asking us that question. I helped build this university.
So you're afraid of questions?
We're afraid of fucking fascists! We're afraid of you.
Afraid of fascists. That's awfully rich coming from a bunch of people claiming that women are under attack because some people are discussing male suicide on your campus. Modern feminism is a totalitarian movement that disguises its disgusting, wretched interior with a nice set of clothes, and by accusing everyone else of doing what they do, routinely. They couldn't possibly be doing what they campaign against, could they? I want you to step back for a moment and think about what the world would be like if modern feminists got exactly what they wanted without resistance. That is my reason for making this long-form video on feminism. As time goes on, we're starting to see more and more ridiculous examples of how men oppress women by definition, how women are victims by definition, and how it's a problem we need to devote our undivided attention to. In this video, I'm going to go through every aspect of modern feminism that I can find and present to you why they are a sexist movement, how they have weaseled their way into the establishment, and how their arguments can't bear minimal scrutiny, yet they are still given credence. The claims of modern feminism are based on faith and faith alone. The beliefs of modern feminism are so untrue and ludicrous that any feminist organization that applies for religious tax-exempt status might actually get it. I'd like to start this video by saying that I am a misogynist, ableist, sexist, racist, regressive, cultural appropriating straight white man. I'll never get laid, no woman would ever want a guy like me, I'm probably a rapist, I'm a whiny man-child whose man-feels are hurt, I'm frightened of women, I pee my pants whenever I'm within 5 feet of a real woman, I live in my parents' basement surviving on a diet of nothing but Cheetos and Mountain Dew, I'm an idiot with no education who has no idea what he's talking about, and I obviously don't care about my mother. Now, let's get to something productive. Feminism. I'm not sure if you noticed, but in the video of feminists dodging questions and being purposefully obtuse to MRAs at the University of Toronto, the woman on the megaphone began her chant by saying, "Feminism is under attack, what do we do?" Then cleverly switched to, "Women under attack, what do we do?" I'll run it by you one more time. Her base instinct was to defend feminism, not to defend women. Even so, feminism wouldn't have been under attack at all if people are just discussing male issues at your campus. The movement is about equality after all, right? It's very strange how feminism, that movement that is supposed to be about equality for both sexes, are so opposed to the men's rights movement. One would think they would be natural allies because feminism is for the equality of both sexes, and MRAs are for the equality of both sexes. Everyone substantially believes the same thing. What we have going on here is a battle of labels. We have an ideological turf war manifesting itself. Feminists want to be the gatekeepers when it comes to the equality of both genders, and everything should be filtered through them and them alone. Any sort of interference with their preferred narrative is considered hate speech.
No hate speech on campus! 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 No hate speech!
If you don't believe that women should be defined as being victims, then you are an enemy of equality. It is amusing, but rather terrifying, to see such a large amount of cognitive dissonance that it has collapsed in on itself, and now not even light can escape the singularity that is the modern feminist mind. Although this particular singularity, like all others, distorts space and time around it and gives them a very different view of the world around them. The No Hate Speech on Campus clip was gathered from a protest at a Warren Farrell lecture. This video displays the modern feminist game plan very well. You'll notice in the video how there were people rushing to get past police. They were practically throwing their entire weight to get into the building. What they would do when they entered the building, I have no idea, but considering their actions when there are law enforcement officials around, I can only imagine what they would do if there was only a bunch of students listening politely to a lecture around. They would attempt to disrupt the lecture in any way they could, and I assume up to breaking the audio equipment in the room and assaulting people. Yet directly after they attempted to charge through officers to get into the building, one of the protesters was pointing at an officer who had someone on the ground and shouted, "Look, look, they have one of our students on the ground." The reason this person is on the ground was because they charged at police officers while trying to enter a building with the sole intent of disrupting the lecture. Their motive? Well, the people in there disagreed with them after all. Here we have a concentrated version of the modern feminist battle strategy. They lash out, and then they get proper retaliation for lashing out, then claim complete innocence and victimhood. But of course I can't say that, or else I'll be accused of victim blaming. No one should pay attention to the fact that they tried to charge through a law enforcement official. Pay attention to the fact that they were stopped and put on the ground. People with this mentality prey on empathy. We are morally obligated to take the side of the victim whenever inequality is afoot. But what happens when those claiming to be victims aren't victims? What if they are the perpetrators? Or they are victims of something so trivial that it shouldn't even be considered an injustice? An example of a trivial injustice would be mean tweets on the internet. Since we're on the subject of injustice, let's finally bust through our first obstacle: patriarchy. Before we get started, it would be sensible to try and understand what patriarchy actually is and how it is defined. PsychAlive sat down with Dr. Carol Gilligan and tried to elicit a response from her. She is a feminist psychologist who currently works as a professor at New York University.
And so I was asked recently by a group of young women, Young Women Leadership Conference program at Harvard, do I think of myself as a feminist? So I said yes. I said, would you like to know how I define feminism? So they said yes. So I said I thought of feminism as one of the great liberation movements in human history. And it is the movement to free democracy from patriarchy. And then I got a bunch of emails after that weekend. This is Harvard group saying the one thing I wrote down from the whole weekend was your definition of feminism. But it seems so obvious to me that that's what feminism is. I mean, it's really seeing, and it's easier for women to speak out against patriarchy because we're not so shamed for speaking out as it is. I think Virginia Woolf wrote about that in Three Guineas, actually. But it's seeing how in contradiction with democracy patriarchy is, and the costs for both men and women. So that's what I think feminism is, and I think it's an extremely important, incredible, historic movement of human liberation. And so, of course, if that's what feminism is, movement to free democracy from patriarchy, you're going to have a kickback from patriarchy. And that makes, and what is it? The kickback is that feminism is anti-men, and real men and all of this. And so I think that's why you have to go back to saying, wait a minute, that's not what feminism is.
Yeah, and I think you have to define what patriarchy really is, too.
Well, you think of patriarchy, yeah, the sort of misunderstanding is sort of men's oppression of women. But In fact, here's where the psychological work is key and the developmental work, because it explains why women's voices are so important in this. Because if men are initiated, boys are initiated into patriarchy around these gender things, which is what is a real man and how is manhood constructed. And being a man means not being a girl or being a woman, and it means being on top. That's patriarchal masculinity. And this happens around 4 and 5 and 6. And girls are initiated into patriarchal femininity, which means being selfless, which is really the most amazing term. Being selfless in order to have relationships. But we just said, if you have no self, you're not in relationships. So it's incoherent, really. But since that doesn't happen till adolescence, girls have more language. And so they can speak about this. And if you silence girls and women, then nobody talks about it. So with all of this, you know, making feminism anti-men, which it's really not, or defining patriarchy not as something that divides everyone. I mean, what does patriarchy means? It's a hierarchy, which means a rule of priests, in which the hieros, the priest, is a patriarch, a pater, a father. So it divides fathers, it divides some men from other men, you know, the men from the boys. Like African American men were called boys, not real men. And it divides all men from women. And it places fathers over mothers and children. And in fact, you know, in making those separations, it divides everyone from parts of themselves. So psychologically, patriarchy is always unstable. On the other hand, if you talk about a democratic society, it requires that kind of people having voices and being able to speak from their experience, speak honestly from their experience. So the psychological quality then feeds into a truly democratic society. So then you come back to patriarchy is contradictory to democracy, like slavery is and like imperialism is. And I think that's where we are right now in that struggle. For men, for women, for people of color, I mean the whole thing. Well, it's like the title of Christina Robb's book, This Changes Everything. It's a shift in the paradigm. It's not like taking the old paradigm and switching it, so instead of having men on top, you have women on top. That's the old structure. It's changing the structure, yeah.
As you can see, hardly any of that represented a coherent flow of thought. Quite frankly, all of the problems she's discussing have been rectified. Women have the right to vote, people of color have their freedom and the right to vote. Her entire characterization of patriarchy has been abolished for at least 50 years. Yet she is describing a kickback from patriarchy, and she is describing patriarchy as if it is a sovereign entity with its own decision-making capabilities. The fact that she can sit there and say feminism isn't anti-men just proves that she hasn't been listening to the things coming out of the mouths of modern feminists. Why are the feminists shown in the introduction so against the men's rights movement? Modern feminism has been far too busy with the pressing issues of manspreading.
May I ask you a question? We're trying to figure out what the right amount of space for a person to take up on the train is. Are you familiar with the term manspreading? Manspreading?
No, I'm not. I try my best not to manspread. I mean, the only reason my legs are open is because there's a bag between it, but otherwise, I'm sit regularly. It's really annoying when people manspread. I've been the victim of manspreading.
Are you familiar with the term manspreading?
Manspreading? Never heard of it before in my life.
I think that's probably because we made it up.
Manspreading?
Manspreading. Okay, so it's this phenomenon we've noticed when men tend to sit with their legs much wider than women do, and a lot of the time it takes up a whole lot of space. And you're not taking up a ton of space, but you're taking up a little bit of space. Have you noticed?
No, I didn't.
What do you think it is?
I don't know. It's not. I hope it's not sexual.
Manspreading. I'm guessing that's the leg as I'm doing like this.
That was a perfect definition.
Yes.
What, have you heard the term manspreading?
No, but is that why you asked me? Was I doing it?
It could be construed it could be construed as a man spread.
Well, it's not too crowded. If it was like super crowded, I would probably constrict.
We have no choice to have our legs like that. You know what I mean?
I do.
You feel me? So yeah, so it's different for a woman.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You know, so yeah, of course, man. If you notice, every man on the train has their legs wide open. Am I correct?
You are.
But you have to.
Have I ever thought that I'm taking up too much space? Not really. But maybe now I am.
Do you feel that you are man-spreading?
Probably at the... no, I'm in my space.
I don't think this is spreading. This is spreading.
I see that two other people are sitting beside me comfortably, so I think that's the standard.
She's a little smushed in. She might be like slightly smushed.
Okay.
What is an acceptable distance? Like, what is like the amount of spreading you can justifiably get away with, in your opinion?
In inches?
Yes.
Oh,
wait, you know, we have a measuring tape, so.
Oh, yeah?
Do you feel like you take up like more space than you need, or you?
Right now, I'm absolutely exhausted, so this is probably the worst time to ask me. I'm probably being an asshole, but I actually usually don't even sit down.
This would be the acceptable amount, I think.
So what is that? Can you measure it? So that's like.
This is an inch shape.
Yeah, just do maybe like your from like inner knee to inner knee. It's like 11.
Okay.
What is like, so the right distance between your legs is?
So 6.5 inches.
6.5 inches.
6 inches, yeah.
Would you mind measuring the correct distance? So that's 11. 7 inches?
I'm a big guy too. Don't worry. I'm 6'2".
It's, let's see, from 18
Cat
inches
calling.
out.
How are you this morning?
Have a nice evening.
Nice. Damn. Damn.
I'm beautiful. God bless. You're sexy. American Eagle. Hello, good morning. God bless you. Have a good day, all right?
And internet harassment to deal with the fact that men are able to be conscripted into being killed and women aren't. They also haven't campaigned for the opening of battered men's shelters despite the recent rhetoric that they want men to be able to feel vulnerable too.
If men don't have to be aggressive in order to be accepted, women won't feel compelled to be submissive. If men don't have to control, women won't have to be controlled. Both men and women should feel free to be sensitive. Both men and women should feel free to be strong. It is time that we all perceive gender on a spectrum instead of two sets of opposing ideals. If we stop defining each other by what we are not and start defining ourselves by who we are, we can all be freer. And this is what he/she is about.
Exactly. Thank you, Emma Watson. If men weren't conditioned into being such horrible people, women wouldn't have to be the victims. That's rich. Of course they want you to be able to feel vulnerable, but actually doing something about your vulnerability is far too much hard work that should be directed towards women's issues. Modern third-wave feminism thrives on the fluidity of its definitions. Patriarchy is one such concept. My theory is that modern feminism would have no leg to stand on without the existence of this supposed patriarchy. Since feminism has historically been about busting the status quo, it is very difficult to fight against yourself when you become the status quo. Thus, modern feminism has to invent the status quo that they are fighting against, which is why this patriarchy theory is actually taken seriously. Their movement is rebellious in nature, and they hardly know how to operate unless they believe they are fighting a large force bearing down on them. I think this is why feminism hates the MRM the way they do. They are a scapegoat. They are the new establishment that needs to be brought down. They are manifestations of the patriarchy in the same way someone sees Satan on a piece of toast. The reason that feminists have a difficult time describing the patriarchy is because they hardly know what it is. They just know its effects. The patriarchy, in my theory, is just a manifestation of people disagreeing with standard feminist rhetoric. Feminists will generally pull a bait and switch between two separate definitions of patriarchy. But I'm not going to allow that to happen to me. I'm going to go over the two most common definitions of patriarchy. Patriarchy definition number 1. A widespread societal system in which males and masculinity are valued above females and femininity. This definition can be actively disproven all the way back to the sinking of the Titanic, where the supposed patriarchy was alive and well. The women and children first, or the Birkenhead drill, was ripe for the enacting while the ship was sinking. It is no doubt that many women died on the Titanic as well, simply due to there being no more space on the lifeboats, or the Titanic just sunk too quickly. If we look at the demographics of the survivors of the Titanic, we can see a very large sway to one side. The total number of men who died was 1,352 out of a total of 1,690 passengers. Only 20% of the men who were on board survived. Approximately 74% of the women on board survived, and 52% of the children survived. Some men were even prevented from getting onto the lifeboats by some officers. Some men were branded cowards, including J. Bruce Ismay, sometimes called the Coward of the Titanic, or J. Brute Ismay, for being a man and surviving the incident. It was just assumed that he didn't do his best to protect women and children, which was the most important thing after all. Even recently with the incident in Kentucky in 2011, when a floating restaurant got separated from its bearings and left 83 people stranded on the Ohio River.
A floating restaurant across the Ohio River from Cincinnati is back under control after it broke away from its moorings and went floating downstream. Officials say Jeff Ruby's waterfront restaurant suddenly pulled away from the Covington, Kentucky shoreline Thursday morning while workers were doing some repairs.
Down there repairing some holes in the bottom of the boat, and the ice coming out of the Licking River piled up and it caused it to break loose, and it was wild after that.
The restaurant eventually came to rest against a bridge.
Well, we kept on going downriver. I finally had rested against the bank. Down there, it spun all the way around and ended up at the end of the bank.
It took tugboats about an hour to catch the restaurant. No one was hurt. This is the second time the waterfront restaurant has broken away. It briefly went floating down the Ohio about 3 years ago with 83 people on board. No one was hurt during that incident either.
Luckily, there were no casualties of either sex, but as always, women were rescued first. Another counterexample to this argument would be the selective service. Women are not required to sign up for selective service and be conscripted into war, yet men can be torn from their families and be forced to kill or be killed on a battlefield, while women are not forced to share that burden. This is a very obvious form of gender inequality that third-wave feminism is largely silent on. It doesn't affect women, so it can be put on the back burner. Remember, feminism is for the equality of both sexes. So I'd assume there is a large feminist campaign to either abolish the draft for both genders, or if they can't accomplish that, make it so women would be forced to sign up too. Unfortunately, there is no such campaign. Modern feminists constantly claim they just want to be equal to men. Well, this is what that entails, yet radio silence unless actively challenged. It is difficult to make an argument that men are valued over women in a society that will happily sacrifice male lives to preserve female ones. And of course, if there were a patriarchy that values masculinity over femininity, why would they send all of their masculine people to die to preserve their feminine people? This is just basic reasoning. Which person does society value more? The people who are left to die, or the people given first access to the lifeboats? The people who are sent to an area where bullets are flying at them from all directions? Or the people not made to do such a thing, and not shamed for abstaining? But that was too easy, wasn't it? I'm going to argue against the second definition now in conjunction with some of these points from the first, because the second definition of patriarchy is what makes all of the credible arguments disproving the first invalid. Patriarchy definition number 2. A widespread societal system which enforces traditional gender roles. This is where the patriarchy hurts men too argument stems from, which sounds very similar to the argument given by fundamentalists when they claim God works in mysterious ways. They claim the reason the Birkenhead drill is in effect is because of traditional gender roles and the enforcement of those gender roles. So we can easily derive from that sentiment, patriarchy hurts men too. However, what this does is create a system where there is no escape. Let's take my previous argument regarding men's shelters and look at it through the lens of the patriarchy theory. There are 4 possible situations regarding shelters. The first situation would be a predominance of women's shelters that turn men away and a supreme lack of funding for male shelters. This is, of course, indicative of a patriarchy, because the traditional role for a man is to be strong and man up, and women are to be treated like helpless, weak, and submissive victims. That would be an enforcement of traditional gender roles, would it not? Yet there is a distinct lack of voices speaking out against this inequality from the feminist movement, who constantly claim that they want to smash gender roles. Feminists support their patriarchy in a treasure trove of ways. The fact that someone saying, "Hey, how are you doing?" to a woman on the street is now considered by feminists to be harassment that women are the victims of, it is no wonder they would say there is an enforcement of gender roles. They are trying their best to enforce them themselves. The second situation would be the reverse of the first. There's an incredible amount of male shelters and hardly any female shelters. This would definitely be a smashing of traditional gender roles. However, this situation comes into conflict with the first definition of patriarchy, and it is obvious that society would be valuing men over women, and that would also be indicative of a patriarchy. The third situation would be that there is no funding, or hardly any funding, for both male and female shelters. This is also indicative of a patriarchy, because men are naturally stronger than women, and so leaving women to fend for themselves against men who are physically stronger than them is putting the clear advantage towards men, which in turn values males over females, and therefore patriarchy. The fourth and final situation would be that there is substantial and equal funding for both male and female shelters. Under the patriarchy theory, I don't really see any giant issues. Men are not being valued over women, women aren't being denied shelters, but then why would modern feminists be opposed to such an option? It seems to be the only way out of the patriarchy theory in this particular case. And yet the moment someone suggests that men deserve domestic violence shelters as well, there is a gigantic, and to use Dr. Gilligan's words,
kickback from patriarchy.
Feminism is its own worst enemy in this case. Let's take a look at a discussion from 1994 between George Gilliland and a couple feminists, one being Charlotte Watson.
Tremendous rise of women's violence against men from 1985 to 1991, and we here at Rolanda are always concerned about violent family situations, and that's why we thought it was important to do this story. I like the points that we've been making. It doesn't matter who's violent. If your home is violent, then we've got to help. There are currently fewer than 6 shelters for battered men in the United States. And we're about to introduce you to the man who helped found the very first one. Where are you, George? George Gilliland. He founded the very first one, the very first shelter for men in the United States. You're joining us live via satellite from St. Paul, Minnesota. Thanks for joining us, George.
Thank you for having me.
George, tell me if you could what the situation was before you founded the shelter. If you were a man being battered by your wife or girlfriend, where could you go? What situation were you in?
Well, you could do the same as I and many other men have done. You can spend the days and nights in your car with very little money in your pocket, or you can humiliate yourself by turning to friends or relatives and begging for a place to stay and food in your stomach if you want to. Other than that, there's virtually no place to turn to. And fortunately, I've heard some comments from some ladies in your audience that have brought that to light, whose thinking is exactly the same as mine. I am not known as a men's rights activist by those that know me and know what we do. I'm known as a man that demands nothing more than equality and the same continuum of treatment for every victim of domestic abuse. I don't care if it's a man or a woman, black or white, lesbian or gay, Catholic, Protestant, Buddhist, or whatever they are. Every person that is a victim deserves the same type of treatment and compassion.
That's right.
And I think, too, that any act of abuse or assault ought to be treated equally. And as you've heard from some other people, this is not the case at all.
From the audience, George.
Just I have a statement. I'm not condoning this at all. But I have to be sympathetic to the women because women have been battered for centuries, and also murdered. Again, I'm not condoning it. I'm not. I'm really not. I'm just saying that me as a woman, I have to be a little bit more sympathetic to my...
What difference does it make who gets battered or slapped, whether it's a male or a female? It is a serious thing.
Relationship.
I think it's important to put things into some kind of perspective. Domestic violence is about power and control. It's about a relationship where there's a whole pattern about trying to maintain power and control, very much like racism. in our country. You know, those of us who are white
You know, I
are born
think
into
Mel
a
hit
kind
it
of
right on the
privilege
head.
just
You're
by the
very
color of our
abusive with
skin.
what you're saying.
And we think that gives us a right to power. And men who batter women are born into this country thinking because they're born male, they have a right to have power over, to be the king of the castle.
I think I asked you
and we're
about
talking
3
about,
years ago.
from the audience,
please.
about power and control.
I just think
George.
it's terrible. Charlotte, I believe I asked you about 3 years ago, where do you come off by saying that domestic violence is man's desire to control a woman, and yet 3 years ago I asked you, how do you account for domestic violence then in gay and lesbian relationships? And you dodged that question, and every other advocate has been dodging it ever since.
I
so
agree with
it doesn't
her
hold any water, Charlotte.
I agree with her that it is about power and control, but women hit to exercise power and control and to coerce
And I have to
also.
say also, I think that Charlotte's approach is dangerous. I really do. Because by scapegoating men, you get men angry, so you get more male violence. And by implicitly condoning I'll let you finish. By implicitly condoning female violence, you get more of that. So all around, you get more violence, more victims. But you see, that's good for Charlotte because that's more money for herself.
And from the audience.
From the audience, I just think it's terrible how the women are so insensitive to men's pain. I know men who are abused, and it's a terrible thing. And I think Mel's skirt looks great.
Charlotte Watson is the executive director of My Sister's Place, which is a chain of shelters dedicated to battered women and children. But that just displays my apparent ignorance of the patriarchy theory. Males are apparently born into their countries with privilege, with a notion that they are supposed to exercise power and control, and that they are supposed to be the king of the castle, and so therefore, patriarchy. And they don't deserve shelters? Well, my goodness, isn't this confusing? There truly is no way out. What is the patriarchy? The patriarchy explains everything. The patriarchy is the reason modern feminists hold the views that they do. It isn't the fact that they're bigoted towards men and want them to not have any shelters to speak of. It's that gosh darned patriarchy. The patriarchy is an interesting entity, because while it hinders men and women, it also justifies the feminist view of why women deserve shelters and men don't. I recognize that she said privilege and not patriarchy, but you have to be aware that male privilege is a symptom of the patriarchy at work. When you actually sit down and analyze the claims that are made, they are absolutely incoherent. They make no logical sense. They use bumper sticker phrases like king of the castle to try and justify bigotry towards men. Anything and everything is the patriarchy. The patriarchy is all around us. Charlotte Watson is using traditional gender roles as an excuse to justify maintaining traditional gender roles. Figure that one out. But that is the end phenomenon of the patriarchy theory. This is where you will end up if you take it to be true and bring it to its inevitable conclusion. Insanity and bigotry. It's always easy to throw around the word fascist in order to denigrate your opponents in an argument, as was shown by the delightful young woman in the introduction of this video. But it's easy to be skeptical of the claim that feminism is about equality when feminists are spending more of their time regulating the number of inches apart men can spread their legs on public transportation, all the way up to actually giving them a measuring tape to record their overt crime of manspreading, all the while ignoring the fact that men are still required to sign up to be possibly forced to participate in a war, and women aren't. In the eyes of an egalitarian, and not a feminist, which injustice do you think deserves a little bit more attention? I think I can leave that to the audience. It's also incredibly ironic that feminists are willing to charge police officers in order to disrupt a lecture on male issues, and yet also seek to regulate the way men sit down in public. They are talking about it like it's some kind of space issue, and yet completely ignore women who leave their bags on seats next to them. The reason they do this is because it isn't a space issue. It is a control issue. Modern third-wave feminism is what you get when you take female adolescent pettiness and manifest it inside of full-grown adults. They seek control all the way down to the way men sit on public transportation. And yet people talking about male issues while they happen to attend that campus is fascism. Speaking about male issues is fascism. The way men sit down is problematic and must be controlled. I just have to say, in my personal opinion, The fact that New York spent $76,707 of taxpayers' money on a man-spreading campaign, and the fact that there is a movement in Toronto proposing to ban man-spreading on public transit, while not even caring about the fact that there are 0 battered men's shelters in Canada, is the biggest argument against a patriarchy I have ever seen. And if feminists can get New York to spend $76,707 of taxpayers' money on an advertisement telling men specifically to sit a certain way, it's tough to argue that feminism isn't the establishment. You can't be claiming that you are bucking the status quo when you are invited to speak at the UN and the room applauds you. Use taxpayer dollars to advertise against men's posture. Have members of the United States government backing a campaign to ban the word bossy, and have members of the UK government supporting the eroding of due process rights of men accused of rape. The status quo agrees with you. And that brings me to my second obstacle: rape culture. Rape culture is another complete fabrication that modern third-wave feminists dream up in order to validate their relevance and control male sexuality down to the most minute detail they can muster. As we did with patriarchy, I think it's a good idea that we get rape culture thoroughly defined so we know what we are up against. Lindsay Anderson, who manages a restorative justice pilot program at Dalhousie University. Wait, Dalhousie University. That rings a bell. Oh yeah. That's the place where feminists tried to get a bunch of students expelled from school for making jokes on the internet. These men were suspended from the campus, and they were in their final year of university. But until restorative justice is enacted, which sounds very Orwellian for paying homage to the feminist church to be washed clean of your sins, and the suspension remains in place, they are unable to graduate. All because some feminists got upset about jokes they made on the internet. They will ruin your life because you told a joke they found offensive, and that is unacceptable. Lindsay Anderson has a bachelor's in criminology from the University of Toronto, that place where feminists tried to stampede through police officers because people were thinking the wrong way, and completed her master's in women and gender studies at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax.
Y is for your sister. O is for oh so tight. U is for underage. N is for no consent. And G, this one varies depending on which end of the country you're on. This was a chant heard during orientation welcome weeks this past September on 2 different campuses. Right here in Halifax, it was a chant led by 80 student orientation leaders to nearly 400 incoming first-year students. An enthusiastic chant about underage, non-consensual sex, about rape. So not only do we have a serious problem with sexualized violence on our campuses, but we're now experiencing the existence of something referred to as rape culture. In a rape culture, we're surrounded by images, language, media representations, laws that perpetuate and validate rape. Sexualized violence is seen as something that's just the way things are. It's simply inevitable. Combine this with a sexualized campus climate, an abundance of alcohol, a cohort that's likely away from their family for the first time, their parental guidance, and people are starting to understand that we're dealing with a problem that requires urgent attention, discussion, and exploration, not ignorance and excuses. But there is good news. We are dealing with a population that is totally able of fixing this problem, and people are starting to take notice. So what did happen on our campuses? How did we get to a point where rape became something to be chanted with pride on the day that we welcome our newest scholars to campus? And how is it that opinions on this incident varied from thoughts that it was just, or that it should be treated with severe punishment and expulsion, to the idea that it was just the mindless act of dirty-mouthed undergraduates behaving badly? And finally, how do we get to a place where being a university student does not increase your likelihood of being sexually assaulted? and where incidents of rape culture are infrequent, and if they do occur, they're approached critically and intellectually instead of with anger and accusations. Up until very recently, I'd been living in residence with undergraduate students for 13 years. You see, there's a whole profession out there for those of us who really enjoy the vibrancy of campus and residence life. Or for those of us who have no idea what we want to do when we graduate and jumped at the chance for full-time employment. But honestly, I loved my experience living in residence. I think it's great to see students go through that transition right into university life. And what's really cool about a job like this is you get to see some really brilliant students do some pretty incredible things. Yet inevitably, we also see some really brilliant students do some not so awesome things. Like the time a bunch of students decided to turn the communal showers into a hot tub by clogging the drains and turning on all the taps. You see, a bathroom like that is not designed to hold that much water weight, resulting in a gaping hole in the floor, substantial water damage to the hallway below, and a very cranky residence life manager making late-night phone calls to carpenters and plumbers and waking up their equally cranky wives. Clearly, living in residence is an experience for growth and learning. I know I certainly learned a lot over the last decade, and I acquired some excellent stories to tell at parties. I wasn't surprised when I heard about the rape chant that took place down the road at St. Mary's University. Over the years, I've witnessed many examples of a sexualized culture and a rape culture amongst the students. For example, it's not uncommon to hear students refer to themselves as having been raped when they face something challenging, be it an exam, a workout, or a meeting. I just got raped by that exam is one I've heard too many times to count. And what about #rapeface? So #rapeface is connected to photos of people making awkward or weird faces, but really what it refers to is the face of a perpetrator before they're about to sexually assault someone. There are thousands of photos on social media with #rapeface. This is rape culture, as if rape is something so normal and so common that we can just joke and laugh about it. This was particularly evident to me during a residence hockey game between two rival residence houses at another university in Nova Scotia. On the day of the game, students would make t-shirts and posters that would promote their own team and put down the opposing team. One woman was seen wearing a t-shirt that proudly proclaimed, "Not enough roofies in the world would get me home with a Burke guy," Burke being the name of the opposing house. Or the student who carried around a pillow with a homemade pillowcase that stated, "Bite down, Burke, Mac is coming in dry." I decided then and there to start calling this behavior for what it is. These students were using references to date rape, drugs, and violent sex to promote their own team at a charity hockey game. And although these are only a few examples, I could share a lot more, we know these incidents are occurring across the country. Very recent examples include the Memorial University Engineering beer mug given to all engineering students, which featured a woman suggestively posed with the words, "If she's thirsty, give her the D," D referring to a slang word for penis. Then there was the songbook, discovered very recently at McMaster University, among the engineering society, a group called the Red Suits. They're like a spirit squad of sorts. It's not exactly clear how widely this was distributed, but just the fact that it featured songs such as "Knock Knock Gangbang" and "Orgies Make the World Go Round," it elicited some concerns. It's very spirited indeed. This book contains a song that has such violent, masochistic, and horrid references that it came with a disclaimer. And it says, "We must warn, there's no good place to sing this. People will be offended. The contents of this next page includes bloody rape, murderous incest, child mutilation, and fetal ingestion at the very least. Proceed with caution." It continues, "The text that follows is small for a reason. If you're willing to read it, you might just have as much fun as we did writing it." And I think this illustrates a very important point. It's very easy for people to suggest that this is just a few bad apples participating in these incidents, or that it's just chalked up to the typical student experience of testing boundaries and creating something simply for its shock value. And yes, this is certainly part of it. But there's also the part about indifference that I find so deeply concerning. Many people likely saw this songbook over the years and didn't feel it necessary to do anything about it.
Now you will notice in Anderson's examples when she's trying to sell the idea of rape culture that she didn't include any examples of people being indifferent to an actual rape. What they were being indifferent to were jokes. If you want to argue that people are indifferent to rape in a particular society, it would be helpful to cite examples of people actually being indifferent to rape in that particular society. It doesn't help your case one bit to cite to people making sexual-themed jokes or even rape jokes. Laughing at a rape joke does not mean you condone or are indifferent to the act of rape. Yet modern feminists can't seem to wrap their head around how comedy functions. You'll also notice that she was referencing a very offensive and risque songbook that was written. The songbook had a disclaimer that warned people it was very offensive and there would be no proper place to sing the songs contained in it. Yet this particular feminist, instead of taking the rational path, being appreciative of the disclaimer, because obviously it was put there for people like her, and avoiding the book, she needs to stop it from existing, entirely. Before this, she advocates for the expulsion of students singing a stupid chant to incoming freshmen, and that is one of the only examples she has that can even be construed as indicative of a rape culture. I'm sure if you actually asked any of those students what their opinion on rape was, they would say it was abhorrent. Going along that theme, there was a recent study done that made the outrageous claim that 1 in 3 college men would rape if they could get away with it. This study was published in the Journal of Violence and Gender, entitled Denying Rape but Endorsing Forceful Intercourse, Exploring Differences Among Responders. Of course, the wonderful reporters at Jezebel and Cosmopolitan jumped on this bandwagon without actually reading the study. The study asked 86 men, who received credit for their participation, from a single university in North Dakota. Only 73 of the men's answers were actually used for analysis, and the study finds that 23 of the men analyzed had intentions to force a woman to sexual intercourse. Of course, only 9 of them actually said they would rape a woman if they could get away with it, and yet feminists then started using the phrase, 1 in 3 college-aged men would rape if we don't call it rape. Please keep in mind that this was done on one campus. They were receiving credit for the survey, and perhaps they maybe didn't take it all that seriously. 9 men saying that they would rape a woman in a survey at one university with credibility not sturdy enough to support helium does not mean there is a plague of rapists in hiding on college campuses. But feminists are so incredibly prone to believing any rape myth that is thrown at them that they look at 9 men answering a survey and can conclude from that 1 in 3 men on every college campus is a secret rapist. Now that we are on the subject of statistics, let's bust through the 1 in 4 women will experience rape or attempted rape claim. If we look at the Bureau of Justice Statistics report that was released in 2013, it shows us a very different story. The rate for rape and sexual assault in the United States in 2012 was 1.3 in 1,000 for people aged 12 and up. Of course, one may say, wait, this doesn't cover attempted rape, but it does. The definition of sexual assault varies from state to state, but they all have laws pertaining to sexual assault, and in all cases, an attempted rape is classified as sexual assault if the rape is not completed. In general, the sentiment is that a sexual assault is sexual activity that is coerced or unwanted. Also, that 1.3 in 1,000 rate constitutes rape or sexual assault, so it wouldn't even be correct to claim that 1.3 in 1,000 women were raped in 2012. It is also shown that the rate of rape and sexual assault is lower than the rate of robbery, the rate of simple assault, and the rate of aggravated assault. There were 346,830 rapes or sexual assaults in 2012. That would mean that women's chances for being raped or sexually assaulted linger around 1 in 470, if we take into account that the victims were all women. And for all we know, there could be a large number of sexual assaults within that statistic that aren't attempted rape. Of course, this doesn't even take into account that every single one of those sociological studies, including the CSA and CDC study that feminists cite to when trying to fearmonger about the presence of rape, doesn't actually vet any of the answers given. None of them flat out asked if they were raped or sexually assaulted. They have non-representative samples of the population, low response rates, extremely broad definitions of rape and sexual assault, some that aren't legally defined as rape or sexual assault, such as inebriated sex in and of itself, and collect their data through online surveys and cold calls. It would be perfectly reasonable to suggest that 1 in 4 women experienced attempted kissing or inebriated sex at some point in their lives. That, however, is not sexual assault. but that is how language can be manipulated. The point of science is to get at the truth, and if this is how the social sciences routinely conduct themselves, then it would be a stretch to call it a science at all. But what about college-aged women? Well, the BJS had a report on that too, derived from the years 1995 to 2013, where the rate was determined to be 7.6 out of 1,000 for non-students and 6.1 out of 1,000 for students. Not exactly a rate that can give you 1 in 5 women will be raped or sexually assaulted in college. And the rate has been decreasing. But let's not let the facts get in the way of a good moral panic.
Our university! Our university! Our university! Our university!
No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. No peace. No peace.
If it's metal, strike it. If it rattles, shake it. If it's wooden, break it. You're listening to the beat of outrage.
We're making this kind of noise because we're standing in solidarity with the women who've gone through this horrible atrocity.
Police say something horrible happened at this house, a gang rape.
I am enraged and disgusted that and embarrassed that something like this has happened.
No one has been charged, but police collected DNA samples from 46 Duke lacrosse players.
Wake up! Wake up! The sun is up! Sunday morning! Time to confess!
Time to come together, time to demand the truth.
We want the members of the Duke lacrosse team to come clean.
They haven't been convicted, but 30-something kids are remaining silent.
So this group is breaking that silence with instruments of percussion as instruments of change.
The banging of pots and pans is a practice that started in Latin America and has spread to other countries. They're the tools that women have in their kitchens, and they're what they use when they want to make some noise protesting domestic violence.
The noise created by the 150 protesters was loud enough to attract onlookers, not too loud to warrant police interference.
You can't run! You can't hide! There's nothing to do but testify!
With no one home, the only thing to do is post signs on the house and hope the message reverberates. Renee Chu, WR.
Time to confess. That's right. Not time to speak out. Time to confess to the crime that we've convicted you of by simply believing you did it. There's nothing like a good witch burning to start the morning. Now, a lot of people will point and laugh and say, look at those morons, but actually analyze what's going on here. These are protesters from the UVA and Duke lacrosse cases, 2 cases that were absolutely fabricated, and yet you have throngs of people protesting, destroying lives, and damaging property over something that never even happened. The fact that feminists can tell us that the media shames rape victims when you have interviews like this one is practically laughable.
And I think when many people read their article, a common response is to just think, well, these students should go to the police. But actually, under our existing law, under Title IX, that the government requires that the government looks at these type of cases as a form of sexual discrimination. So it requires the schools to handle these things through their internal process. And as we're now seeing, their internal processes usually are designed to protect the school's reputation. And even as we're talking about UVA here, I mean, when you see the list, not just it's UVA. Not just UVA, and nor is it just what you. Sure, there are some schools on the list of that are being the list of schools being investigated by the government. Some of the schools, maybe you can say, like Arizona State, or University of Colorado, or Boulder. Maybe they're considered party schools, but there are plenty of schools on that list: Catholic University, Dartmouth, Princeton, Harvard, even Harvard Law School, that are not quote unquote the party schools. So it's not just UVA, and it's not just these party schools. It's widespread.
And when you bring up the party thing, this is so important because the response has been, we saw November 22nd that the University of Virginia has decided to suspend all fraternities until January. Of course, most students are not even on campus most of December. But the thing, I think the second most painful after the hold its leg for me was this. The 3 friends launched into a heated discussion about the social price of reporting Jackie's rape. Detached Jackie listened as Cindy prevailed over the group. She's going to be the girl who cried rape and will never be allowed into any frat party again. And here's the thing, they're not wrong. It's, you know, on the one hand, it's appalling. On the other hand, they're not wrong. And that social sanction is a powerful one at 18. And I'm sitting there thinking, these kids are 3 weeks into college. This can't be the first time they've encountered this. How far back does this go into high school? Like,
well, I would say that social sanction is a powerful thing at any age, not just at 18, at any age. Before I say anything else, I have to thank you, Sabrina, for writing this. I think you've done a tremendous act of public service, and I'm genuinely very, very grateful.
Thank you.
It is hard to read an article like this and avoid the conclusion that we live in a culture that hates women, just hates us. It's hard to read an article like this and conclude that the men in this culture, boys and men in this culture, are raised to see women as not just less than them, but in some cases as less than human.
Who in their right mind can say that we live in a society that hates women? There are throngs of people protesting, calling innocent men rapists, demanding their expulsion, damaging the frat building, all because one woman told a fib. And you ran with it. You want to talk about rape culture? I'll talk about rape culture. Feminists and the media just can't seem to learn their lesson. The past 3 cases they have tried to use to demonstrate rape culture have been absolute fabrications by the accuser. The Duke lacrosse case was false, the UVA case was false, and the case of the woman holding the mattress constantly is also reasonably certain to be false. This girl accused a man of raping her, yet Facebook messages reveal that she asked him for sex before the incident and asked to see him again. And this statement, I don't find funny at all. I find it terrifying. This woman, Emma, who accused this man of rape, actually wrote, I think it's ridiculous that Paul would sue not only the school, but one of my past professors for allowing me to make an art piece. It's ridiculous that he would read it as a bullying strategy, especially given his continued public attempts to smear my reputation when it's just an artistic expression of the personal trauma I've experienced at Columbia. If artists are not allowed to make art that reflect on our experiences, then how are we to heal? Emma, who falsely accused Paul of raping her, is now complaining that he is smearing her reputation. And her carrying the mattress around is just an expression of her fictional trauma at his hand. Why in the world would he sue over that? Fascism will shoot you. Third-wave feminism will shoot you and then make your family apologize for making you go through something so traumatic. George Orwell once said, if you want to imagine the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. I'd like to qualify that. If you want to imagine the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face and the face being stepped on, apologizing to the boot for what it's going through. These people are vindictive bullies who will cry victim even if they are the ones smearing your good name with baseless accusations. And when you uncover that the accusations are baseless and you take legal action against it, they claim you are tarnishing their reputation. Lashing out, then getting retaliation, and then playing the victim. The feminist battle strategy. Their claim is that false accusations happen so rarely, yet the past 3 cases lauded by feminists as indicative of rape culture have been wholly manufactured. Either they are very unlucky, or maybe false accusations happen a bit more often than they claim. But the mantra is to believe the victim, which is an attack on the very basic principle of innocent until proven guilty. But of course, according to Wendy Murphy, who is a professor at the New England School of Law, believes something a little different. I'm really tired of people suggesting that you're somehow un-American if you don't respect the presumption of innocence, because you know what that sounds like to a victim? Presumption, you're a liar. Because if a few men have to be falsely thrown in a tiny cage for the rest of their lives to protect a woman's feelings, then so be it. But society hates women. You want to know who trivializes rape? People like Catherine McKinnon, who said, feminism is built on believing women's accounts of sexual use and abuse by men. I call it rape whenever a woman feels violated. And also, people who put out videos like this gem.
Yes, I've been getting raped. I don't even remember since when. Maybe it started when I came out of my mother's womb. I get raped at several places: trains, public buses, offices, even at my own house. I got raped when my dad hit my mom. I got raped when my mother called someone else's daughter a slut. I got raped when my brother teased someone else's sister. I get raped every day, several times, by thoughts, by words, by looks. I try to see their faces, but I can't see them. I only see my family.
If any one organization fits the definition for rape culture, it is the modern feminist movement. And much like the patriarchy, they create their own problems so that they can fix them. It's a never-ending cycle. They will tell lies as long as necessary for their dogma to become truth. And speaking of lies told for so long that they become truth, that brings me to my third and final obstacle: the wage gap.
In 2010, women earned only 77 cents to every man's dollar.
Among the big topics at play in the race for governor in Texas is the issue of equal play in the workplace. Equal pay in the workplace. You heard of that? I've heard of it. I've worked on it.
Welcome back to Hardball. It's Equal Pay Day today, the date symbolizing the additional days of work necessary for a woman to complete in the new year before she makes what a man is calculated to have made the year before.
Wait. Well, don't tell me the reasons are. Do women make less than men for doing the same work?
No, because...
Wow. Okay.
Well, for example...
But today, women make up about half our workforce. But they still make 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. That is wrong. And in 2014, it's an embarrassment. Women deserve equal pay for equal work.
The wage gap has been disproven ever since it was brought into existence by sexism-obsessed nutjobs who think that taking the median wages of men and women equal women getting paid less for the same work. It seems like in order to be a feminist, it has to be a requirement that you have no idea how to interpret data. When you go over all of the variables that can be taken into account, such as number of hours worked, in what field people are working, and amount of job experience, and things that are very difficult to quantify, such as payment based on quantity or quality of production, merit systems, salary negotiation, and last but not least, discrimination. When you actually account for the things that can be quantified, the gap shrinks to a minuscule 4 to 7 cents. That leaves all of the unquantified variables ripe for the picking for feminists. However, they ignore every single factor except for discrimination. Of course, they have no proof that discrimination accounts for the entirety of that adjusted wage gap. They just assume it to be true. They also just assume that men are never discriminated against in their wages, which is why they constantly compare their wages to an entire dollar a man is earning. And that is the key word, isn't it? Earning. Perhaps Thomas Sowell can explain it better than I can.
You're right, I'm going to quote you again. Among the many factors which influence male-female economic differences, the most elusive is employer discrimination.
Yes, that when you correct for all the various factors, such as the number of hours worked, the continuous employment versus taking a few years out to have children and so on. You take all that into account, the differences between men and women become quite trivial. If you look at the academic world, or as far back as 1969, women who had never married and who had earned higher incomes than men who had never married, they became tenured professor at a higher rate than men who were never married. And then later on, if you look at the general population, if you take the women who are past the childbearing years and who work continuously, their incomes were higher than men who would work continuously, and so on. So the difference is that not that the employer is paying them differently, but that they have different characteristics.
So the central variable in explaining economic differences between men and women is not employer discrimination, not the rise of feminism. It's that women, it's child rearing, marriage and child rearing. That's the variable. As that varies, a women's arrival or participation rate in high-level occupations varies with that. That's
Absolutely.
The core. Okay. Now, in principle, you note, family responsibilities could be perfectly evenly divided between fathers and mothers. But that isn't the way it has worked in practice. Quote, I'm quoting you again, since economic consequences follow from practices rather than principles, the asymmetrical division of domestic responsibilities produces male-female differences in income, close quote. Question, what are the policy implications of that? If we become fixed on eliminating male-female income differences, is it the case that the only choice, the only route for doing that is to involve the government in redesigning the very nature of the family?
Well,
or am I leaping to a melodramatic conclusion?
No. Yeah, and logically that's certainly true. However, not all domestic responsibilities can be shared equally, such as having babies, which is not an inconsequential thing since the existence of the human race depends on it. But what it means is that women make choices that make a lot of sense for them. For example, the choice of occupations, that women tend not to go into occupations in which there's a very high rate of obsolescence. I mean, and if you're a computer engineer and you take 5 years out to have a child and have the child up to the age where you put him in daycare, well, my gosh, the world has changed.
Your job is gone.
You'd have to start way back. On the other hand, if you become a librarian, you become a teacher, other occupations like that, then you can take your 5 years off, come back, and pick up pretty much where you left off.
But therein lies the problem. No matter how rational the argument, and how many times the claim is refuted, it is still believed. That is why the rational argument portion is so simple. And I'd like to avoid playing sexism whack-a-mole with feminists, realizing that their ad hoc rationalization is exactly like someone pointing out a gap in scientific knowledge and saying, God did it. If you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes the truth. Either it becomes the truth, or people pander to appease a certain demographic. Do you honestly want to know how long the termites have dined? The President of the United States passed an amendment to the Equal Pay Act of 1963 called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act in 2009, which made every single new unequal paycheck a new violation of the law. What do you think the consequences would be if there was rampant discrimination directly after this law was signed into effect? Wouldn't one expect a rush to the courts for all of these women who have been discriminated against for so long? But that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because they aren't being discriminated against. And if paying women unequally wasn't already illegal enough, Congress is actually debating passing the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would add even more to the Equal Pay Act of 1963. One of the things the Paycheck Fairness Act would do is make it so employers would need to prove that the unequal wage is based on legitimate business practices as opposed to gender discrimination. However, the Equal Pay Act of 1963 explicitly states, even if the individual makes each of these showings, the defendant may avoid liability by proving that the wage disparity is justified by one of four affirmative defenses, that is, that the employer has set the challenged wages pursuant to 1. A seniority system, 2. A merit system, 3. A system which measures earnings by quantity or quality of production, or 4. A differential based on any other factor other than sex. The Paycheck Fairness Act is just a recodification of something that is already encased in law. The termites have dined so long and so well that members of the U.S. government are supporting new legislation that is already in effect based on outrage fed through propaganda and misinformation. Go ahead and try to argue that feminism isn't the establishment, and they are the underdog punching up at the system. If the US government will buy into this propaganda, what is stopping it from eventually buying into male privilege? What is stopping it from buying into the patriarchy theory? What is stopping it from beginning the erosion of due process rights for men accused of rape? Oh wait.
An estimated 1 in 5 women is sexually assaulted at college, and that's totally unacceptable.
It is estimated that 1 in 5 women on college campuses has been sexually assaulted during their time there. 1 in 5.
But you know, we all know that many of our schools just aren't safe. We know the numbers. 1 in 5 of every one of those young women who's dropped off that first day of school, before they finish school, will be assaulted in their college years.
The people who you elect into office have power over you, and they are buying the feminist talking points at face value. There is no doubt that people in the White House know how to interpret data. There is no doubt that people know the wage gap is a fabrication, that rape culture is nonsense, and that the patriarchy theory is ridiculous. But considering their track record, it's only a matter of time. What do you do to combat this? Vote in people who refuse to give these concepts credence. Stick on feminists and make them prove every single one of their assertions. Have debates in public forums with them if they aren't too frightened to. Exercise your freedom of speech while you still have it. Complain about it while you still can, because that is what they are afraid of most. More dissent. More speech. They are a totalitarian movement that wishes to control men all the way down to how many inches they spread their legs on public transportation. This next generation is the next generation of leaders. People who will believe this garbage will begin running things. And do you want to know what the world will look like if these people are elected and have power over you? Like this.
Just leave this small or? Yeah, just leave it. You're not leaving the convention? Just this? Okay, yes. That's fine. Thank you.
Could you please make sure he's permanently kicked out of this convention, please?
You want him out of the convention?
He needs to get going permanently. Okay. We need security to follow that person.
What did he do?
This is Ralph Victoria. This person's doxing my family. This is Ralph Victoria. He's taking pictures without my permission. If you're not going to get that, I can't speak.
Where is he? He just walked out. Okay, he's out the door.
He's not here. He cannot go down to the bus. He just took pictures without my permission. I have to show. Excuse me, sir.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, I've got a quick question. I need everyone, please, there will be no recording of this at all. Please, no picture.
Universities are indoctrinating students into believing falsehoods. The government is preparing legislation based on falsehoods. Far too many people believe in the falsehood, and it's only a matter of time before all of their ridiculous and totalitarian suggestions are taken seriously by members of the governments under which we live, for the sake of women's safety. Don't let it happen. The future rests with you.